You disappeared on purpose, not by leaving, by staying so useful, so reliably in the room that nobody ever had a reason to look for what was underneath the usefulness. Not you either. You just got very, very good without ever training for it at not being found. There was a version of this that made sense. There usually is, somewhere back, before you can fully account for it. You learned a rule that nobody stated out loud. The room stayed calmer when you were useful in it. Maybe it was a parent whose mood you could read from the sound of a door closing. Maybe it was a house where love arrived conditionally, dressed up as approval, and approval arrived only after you had done something for someone. You didn't decide to become the helper. You noticed the way a child notices weather, that being helpful was the version of you that got to stay in the room. Nobody sat you down and explained the rule. You just kept track of which version got to stay. So you built it, carefully, without meaning to. You became the one who remembers what people need before they ask, the one who softens conflict before it becomes conflict, the one whose presence in any group is measured by what they contribute, not by what they simply are. By the time you were old enough to notice you were doing it, it wasn't a strategy anymore. It was just Tuesday. You were the friend who showed up with the right words already assembled, the sibling who could read a room before anyone else's shoes were off, the one teachers describe without quite meaning it as a compliment, as mature for their age. Mature, in this case, meant already fluent in managing other people's weather. And for a long time, a genuinely long time, it worked. You got good at it the way people get good at anything they practice under pressure, which is to say, completely, and without ever quite noticing the practicing. It worked because it wasn't fake. That's the part that gets lost later when this all starts to hurt. The helping was real. The attentiveness was real. You are, in fact, good at noticing what people need. That was never the lie. The lie, if it can even be called that, since nobody sat you down and taught it to you on purpose, was smaller and quieter than a lie. It was an equation. Being needed equals being allowed to exist here. And once an equation like that sets, you stop checking whether it's still true. You just keep solving it over and over in every room you walk into for the rest of your life. You did the math so many times it stopped feeling like math. It just felt like weather, like breathing, like the specific tiredness of being the last one, still paying attention in a conversation that ended 20 minutes ago for everyone else. People loved you for it. That's the part that makes it so hard to question. Nobody around you experienced your helpfulness as a wound. They experienced it as a gift because it was one, and because gifts that keep arriving on time don't usually get inspected for what they're costing the person giving them. You became, without campaigning for it, the reliable one, the one people go to, the one whose name comes up when someone says, "Ask her, she'll know what to do," or "Call him, he always picks up." None of them were wrong to love it. They just never had a reason to ask what it cost, because you never once made the invoice visible. You'd have told them, probably, if anyone had thought to ask the follow-up question. Nobody did. Why would they? The system was working exactly as designed. There is a version of you, a thinner, less examined thought experiment of a person who grew up in a house where being useful wasn't the price of admission. You don't know what that version does with an unscheduled afternoon. You don't know what it wants when nobody needs anything from it. That's not a person you got to become. That's a hallway you walked past so many times it stopped registering as a door. And somewhere in the middle of being that, of being genuinely good at it, of watching it genuinely work, a second, quieter thing was also happening. You were learning that the version of you that didn't help, that had nothing to offer, that was simply present without doing anything for anyone, had quietly started to feel unsafe, to show, not forbidden, just untested. You didn't know what would happen if you walked into a room empty-handed. You had stopped being willing to find out. Carl Jung had a word for the version of you that meets the world. He called it the persona, not because it was fake, but because it was a mask in the oldest sense of the word. A face built for the outside, made from whatever the outside seemed to reward. He was careful to say the persona isn't the enemy. You need one. Everyone does. It's how a person survives the fact that they have to be legible to other people in order to live among them. The danger, in a Jungian reading, isn't wearing the mask. It's forgetting it's a mask at all. There's a particular kind of person the mask fits so well that it stops feeling like something worn and starts feeling like something they simply are. The scholar becomes indistinguishable from his books. The performer can't find the border between the voice on stage and the one at home. And the helper, the one whose currency has always been usefulness, eventually can't locate a self underneath the helping, because there was never a version of the self that got practiced without it. This is not the same as saying you are fake. It's closer to saying you are incomplete on purpose, in a very specific direction. Somewhere behind the persona of the reliable one, in a Jungian reading, is everything that persona had no room for. Not because those things are shameful in some cosmic sense, but because they didn't fit the job description you built for yourself. Needing something from someone. Being tired in front of people who came to you for strength. Being angry that the calls only ever go one direction. None of that got to live in the front room. So it went where unlived things go. What Jung called the shadow. Not a moral verdict. In a Jungian reading, simply the address of everything a persona couldn't carry. Persona, done well, is supposed to be porous. A self you can put down at the door and pick back up on your way out. The way an actor sets down a role at the stage door and picks up their own tiredness instead. The failure isn't wearing the mask. The failure is losing the doorway. Somewhere along the way, for reasons that made sense at the time, the door stopped being a door. It became the only room. It shows up first at home, usually, then at work, where it gets rewarded with a different currency. Reliability, promotion, the quiet reputation of being someone who never drops the ball. By the time it reaches your friendships, it isn't a behavior anymore. It's simply what showing up means to you now. None of this is deception. It's just how thoroughly the pattern generalizes once it's rewarded enough times. This is where it gets quietly cruel if you sit with it long enough. The parts of you that got exiled for not being useful enough are, very often, the parts that most needed someone else's help. In this reading, the need itself becomes shadow material, which means the very thing you'd have to admit to in order to finally receive the kind of care you've spent years giving away, is the thing your whole persona was built to keep hidden. You didn't just learn to give, you learned to make your own needing invisible to yourself first, so that it would never accidentally show up and cost you the room. There's a name for this, not Jung's. It comes from a different lineage, German psychoanalyst Wolfgang Schmidbauer, writing about people who help for a living or a life. The term he chose is unglamorous on purpose. Helper syndrome, not a diagnosis so much as a description of a pattern. Someone who gives care not from an overflow of it, but from a place where giving is the only form contact is allowed to take. It isn't a Jungian concept. It doesn't need to be to describe the same shape from a different angle. A life, organized so completely around being useful to others that being simply present without offering anything starts to feel like a kind of trespassing. Jung had another word worth borrowing here for what tends to happen when a persona is driven hard enough toward a single extreme: enantiodromia. His term for the way an attitude, pushed far enough in one direction, can eventually flip into its opposite. Not a punishment, a pattern in a Jungian reading that shows up again and again. The version of you that never once let itself be tired can arrive, one day, at something closer to detachment. The anger that was never given a room can find one anyway, disguised as coldness toward the very people you used to run toward. Not a moral failure, closer to a persona that was asked to hold more than any persona was built to hold. Finally, quietly, buckling under its own excess. None of this arrives as a single dramatic collapse. It arrives as a Tuesday that feels, for no clear reason, unbearably heavy. The kind of heaviness that has no obvious cause, so it gets filed under tired, under stressed, under anything other than its actual name. None of this means the helping was hollow. That's the trap in the framing, and it's worth naming directly. This isn't a story about discovering that your care was secretly selfish or that the people who love you for it were fooled. The care is real. What's also true, sitting right next to it, plainly, is that somewhere along the way, the helping stopped being a thing you do and became the only shape you knew how to exist in. Those are two different sentences. Most people, encountering this idea, try to collapse them into one. Either my helping is fake or this is nothing, I'm fine. Because sitting in both at once, care that is real and a self that has gone missing inside it, is a harder place to stand than either alone. Most people don't stay there long enough to notice both are true at once. This is asking you to stay a little longer than that. Somewhere, in a kitchen lit by nothing but a phone screen, a man is typing back to a friend who is having a bad night. The refrigerator hums behind him. Outside the window, the street holds the particular kind of quiet that only exists after midnight, when even the porch lights have started to look tired. He knows exactly what to say. He always does. It's the fastest thing about him, this particular kind of fluency, faster than anything he's ever managed to say about himself. His thumb moves fast, certain, kind, a paragraph of the right words arriving in someone else's dark room like a light turned on for them. He hits send, and for a second, the apartment goes very quiet, the way it does after the good deed is finished and there's nothing left to do. He doesn't type anything to anyone about his own week. There's no one he's rehearsed that message for. He sits there a moment longer than the task required, phone still lit in his hand. Not because he's waiting for a reply, he never is, but because some part of him is checking, out of old habit, whether staying in the room a little longer without being useful in it is something he's still allowed to do. For a second, his own reflection catches in the dark window glass above the sink. A stranger-shaped outline, backlit by a screen full of someone else's crisis. He doesn't really look at it. If you asked him what he was thinking, right then, he'd have an answer ready inside 2 seconds. That's the part of him that never stops working. He puts the phone face down on the counter before he finds out what the other part would have said. Here's the sentence this video has been circling, and it isn't a comfortable one. Try right now to describe yourself without mentioning what you do for anyone else. What you notice before they say it, what you fix, what you carry so someone else doesn't have to. And see how quickly you run out of things to say. That isn't because there's nothing under the helping. Not because you're empty. It's because the part of you that exists apart from it was never given anywhere to practice. Because the room where self might have grown up was always, without exception, booked for someone else's crisis. You built the helper so early and so well that it became the only shape your presence has ever taken in a room, not a mask you put on before walking in. The walking in itself. And here's the part that doesn't get softened, because softening it would be one more version of the same old move, making the moment easier to sit with, managing it the way you manage every moment. Somewhere along the way, you stopped being someone who helps and became, without ever agreeing to it, a function that happens to have your face. The useful one, the one who's always fine. You didn't lose yourself in a single afternoon dramatic enough to remember. You traded it quietly, one small usefulness at a time, for so long that there was never a day marked clearly enough to call it the day it happened. If you went looking for that day now, you'd find 1,000 small candidates and no single crime scene. This is not a story where you dig underneath the helping and find a fully formed person who's been waiting there the whole time, patient, intact, ready to be let out, arms crossed, waiting for you to finally notice them. That would be a kinder story than this one. What's actually down there, if you go looking honestly, might be closer to an outline. The shape of someone who was never finished, because every hour that might have gone into finishing them went instead into being useful to somebody else. That thinner version from before, the one who never had to learn any of this, who might have spent a Tuesday doing something for no reason except wanting to, isn't buried somewhere under the helper. It was never fully built. You didn't lose it. You simply never finished drafting it, because every hour that might have gone toward that had already been spoken for. Grief, if this is grief, isn't for something taken. It's for something that was never given the years it needed to exist. There is no version of this video where the next thing that happens is you learning to ask for help and everyone rising to meet you and the loneliness resolving into something warmer. That would be a good story. It would also be a lie about how identities this deep tend to move. You do not simply decide one evening to stop being the reliable one and find a self waiting underneath, intact, ready to be worn instead, like a coat that's been hanging in a closet the whole time, just slightly out of season. There may not be a self waiting underneath at all, not one that's finished, not one that's ever been given the years of practice the helper got. That's not a failure to fix by next Tuesday. That's just what it costs to build a persona this thoroughly. For this long, the alternative doesn't come pre-assembled. It has to be built the same slow, undramatic way the helper was. Except now. Without the reward of instantly working. Without the room getting quieter and safer the moment you do it right. In the meantime, there is only this. A version of you that keeps showing up as useful. Because that's the only rehearsed thing it knows how to be. walking through a life that keeps rewarding exactly the pattern that's costing it the most. Nobody involved is a villain in this. Not the people who keep calling, not the version of you that keeps answering. It's just a system running exactly as built, with no one currently positioned to interrupt it. So this is not a video that ends with you learning to receive. It's a video that asks you to stay for a while in the plainer and less redemptive fact underneath. That you built a shelter so good at keeping other people warm, nobody ever thought to check whether you were cold inside it, including you. That the loneliness you're circling isn't a problem waiting for a solution. It's the precise, logical shape of a life organized around being useful. And it will not dissolve because you finally named it quietly in the dark. If you're waiting for the sentence that turns this into a lesson, it isn't coming. Not because there's nothing left to say, because staying here without turning any of it into a next step might be the one thing on this list you haven't already tried. There is no music swelling under this part. There is no version where the void turns out to have been a door the whole time. It was just a void. Staying in it without reaching for the next task is not nothing, but it is also not a turning point. It is just tonight being looked at directly for once, without flinching away toward the nearest available task. Some things don't break open into anything. They just get seen clearly for what they are. And staying with that, without immediately reaching for the next helpful thing to do about it, might be the first hour in a long time you've spent not fixing something. Somewhere tonight, someone is going to text you. They're going to need something. Advice, a favor, a shoulder, 5 minutes of your unbothered attention, and you're going to give it because that's who you are and because you're not wrong that it matters. You'll probably answer before you've even decided to. That's how practiced this is. Practiced enough that the deciding part happened years ago, somewhere you can't quite point to. Tomorrow, you'll wake up and be useful again, probably before you've even had coffee. That's not a failure. Habits built this early don't dissolve just because you finally saw the shape of them. This isn't asking you to stop. It's just naming quietly what's true underneath the giving. That somewhere in you is a person who has never once been asked the question first. Not fixed, not found, just there, waiting the way a room waits for someone to walk in without needing anything from it at all. Maybe the someone is you. Not because you fixed anything, just because for once you looked. Or maybe it isn't yet. Maybe tonight is just the night you notice the room, and that quiet noticing is the only thing that's actually new.